Oh, the icon change.
Hi, and welcome to the NewbQuest podcast. I'm your host, Matt Mirafish, and on the show, we talk about game development with an aim to helping out people who are new to the field or just want to learn more. My guest today is Steve Swink, who is the developer of Scale, also an experienced game development educator and author. Hi, Steve.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. How are you?
Yeah, I got my coffee.
Good. I got some coffee too. I've got iced coffee.
Oh, fancy. Yeah, I'm in Arizona, so I should have iced coffee, but the hot stuff that we brew is way better, so.
Understood. Well, so maybe for the people who are not familiar with you and your work, we could start out talking a little bit about your current project, which is called Scale.
Sure. Yeah, it's a first-person, well, the tagline is like first-person reality manipulation game with a unique resizing mechanic. That's kind of the tagline, but I mean, it's just it's an experiment. It's an experiment to try and find interesting gameplay out of doing something you can't normally do in a game, right? It's just like, hey, you can scale things as much as you want, whenever you want. So what are the interesting things that fall out of that is kind of the exploration. And I decided to do first-person because it's easier to just kind of point at something and say, that's what I want to scale. I've seen a lot of people who've done little scale games that are about scaling things, but they're from a side perspective, and you have a little character or something like that. And it makes it really hard to have a reference point for the scale of objects. So I kind of decided that first person was the way to go with that. Yeah, I don't know.
Nice, awesome. And so how long have you been working on that now?
A couple of years. Yeah, something like that. I had a prototype forever ago, but I only really got serious about it 2 years ago, year and a half ago, something like that.
Nice, yeah, it seems like a really interesting mechanic, and I love the kind of visual aesthetic that you've settled on lately, especially the idea, it's become a kind of a look that some other people have been using, but the sort of untextured 3D, or in the texture kind of built into the models.
There's two reasons for that. One is a self-defense mechanism, which is just I don't have the resources to make detailed 3D art with normal maps and all that stuff. But the other is that when you scale things as much as you want, you need to not have detail lost when things get really big and you're really close to them. And so the version I had before was like pixel textures that didn't get resampled at all when they got scaled up and down, which worked, but I didn't really like the look that much. So the other thing I could think of was just to make it geometry. So the polygons don't lose fidelity as they get larger and smaller. So it's like put the detail in the polygons and then it works.
Yeah, it's almost like a 3D vector art kind of style, or sort of analogous. And so are you, well, first of all, so a point that you touched on there that I think is interesting and worth talking about is just the idea, so you are pretty much the sole maker of stuff on this game, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the guy, right? It's like my idea, and I do a lot of the work and a lot of the programming and pretty much all the design and some of the artwork. But I have a lot of people that have helped me that, you know, if I didn't have people helping me, the game wouldn't have happened at all. So
Right.
For example, Eddie Boxerman is helping me with physics programming, and my friend Andrew Kagashal is doing artwork because he's like one of those amazing people he can program, but he's also a really good artist, and so he understands pipeline, and so he's been helping a lot with like crazy tech for artwork and stuff like that.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I kind of took from your statement is just the idea of working, kind of combining style and limitations, you know, kind of recognizing, okay, this is both because of like the aesthetic of the game, right, that having these huge smeary textures is probably going to end up looking sort of unattractive, but then also that, you know, you're not going to have the time or the resources or the team to go and make, you know, hundreds of super detailed textures with normal maps and so on. So kind of choosing an aesthetic that can kind of exploit that, I think, is a useful lesson for people who are kind of starting out, just to think, okay, I can't do this, I can't do that. What's the kind of style that I can work within that?
Well, I think especially when you're a small team, you need to look for an aesthetic that is lateral from the way that things would normally be done in AAA or some high polished production game. They look for a style that's easy to execute and then is visually satisfying and works, but is not is unique enough to not just be another kind of everyone makes like Mirror's Edge like games in Unity now because the light map making got better or whatever. So it's like, okay, it's flat textures and let's bake the light maps or whatever. But I think whatever aesthetic you choose, you need to be in the direction of can execute easily, but also in the direction of can be different, can stand out. It's really hard. It's really hard to come up with an aesthetic that meets both of those criteria. But that's why games that we look back on, like Super Brothers, like Sword and Sorcery, it's pixel art, but it's his very particular style of pixel art, and it has clean gradients all over the place. In going with the pixel art, and it's a very particular palette. It's very desaturated, and it's very obviously Super Brothers when you see it. So, yeah.
No, I think those are some really great points, and I love the word lateral. I think that as a way of thinking about it, just that you see, especially with small team indie stuff or people who are new or whatever, they have influences from teams that are much, much bigger than theirs, and they're like, oh, I'm gonna make like my favorite game, and it just ends up being just like a way, way worse looking version of your favorite game,
Right.
which is just kind of sad. And so kind of thinking about, okay, how can I kind of zag when everybody else is zigging, and obviously combining that with working within your limitations. I had something that I think actually applies to scale as well, as I had Kelly Santiago on for the last episode, and something that she had said publicly before, and that we talked a little bit about it on the interview, was the idea that when they were first showing Cloud, the fact that it was this bright blue was kind of like the dominant color on the screen, and it's in between all the, like at a trade show, for example, it's in between all these other things that are like brown, black and brown, black and purple. And that's something I noticed with Scale as well, is there's just this rich, vibrant color palette that really pops with the kind of 3D art style. I thought was really interesting and a great way to kind of, differentiate in a kind of a nice way.
Kelly's really smart. I like Kelly a lot. I've known her forever, since the Cloud days, I think. Yeah, well before Flower. Yeah, she's right. The problem now, of course, is that if you go to a trade show, it's all the people have realized that, and now there's this whole gamut of really fascinating things. So it's like the AAA stuff, which all looks the same palette, Space Marine stuff. But then there's like the bright, beautiful thing here, and then the bright, beautiful thing here, and then the weird, like it looks like a 40s like poster painting Art Deco kind of, or yeah, Art Nouveau kind of thing. And then there's a thing over here that looks like a painting on the side of a masonry jar from ancient Greece, and it's like all this stuff. So now it's even more difficult to find something that really stands out. I do think, yeah, you can screw yourself pretty badly, I think, actually, though, because I think I'm seeing a lot of games coming out right now that the art style is sort of wagging the dog, where people have made this art style and they did a little treatment, and that's pretty easy to do. You can do that in a couple of weeks to get a cool art style going, but they don't really have the game yet, and people get really excited about it. By people, I mean like journalists and stuff, but they just don't have a game, and so it's not like the art style melds really well with the game, and then those two things complement each other and become a really greater than the sum of their parts kind of thing. It's like, okay, well, we play the game, and now we realize, all right, well, it really is just kind of an art style.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's funny. I was on the tigsource.com's forum, and a guy on there.
Go there.
You wouldn't go there? Oh,
I used to go there, as did a lot of my friends who. We invested a lot of energy into posting stuff there, but it just became kind of this weird wasteland. Some of the subforums are still really good, like the art one and like the feedback one are really good, but there's just pages and pages of vitriol by people who don't make games and apparently don't play games either. They just have opinions. It's like, oh, all right, well.
You mean it's a place on the internet?
Well, it didn't used to be that. It used to be our nice little indie island, but then everything got too popular, and so
yeah, it's funny because I had heard I think it was maybe Derek Yu or Alaka Holoka who had obviously Derek Yu is obviously one of the owner of the site or the manager of the site and sharing that opinion, and I was a little bit kind of turned off from it, but also looking for places to kind of meet other new developers and indie developers online. And I actually have to say that I didn't have that experience of. I mean, certainly I saw, like any other place, there are people trolling and stuff, but I found, like especially in the devlogs forums and a few other people, a lot of very nice people doing cool stuff and having pleasant, supportive kind of interactions. So
every once in a while I dip back in there, and it does seem like it's kind of swinging back the other way. Yeah, like the devlog forum is really good, and the art one is really good. Like those are still worth perusing.
Maybe because it's only people in there who are making stuff and know how hard it is.
That's the problem, right? Yeah, everybody's cool who makes stuff, I think, because everyone realizes how hard it is, and they're really supportive to each other. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of that, and it's a bit of when people become successful by other people's measures. So, like when Spelunky was really popular, even before it was a commercial version that Derek was making his living off of or whatever, it drove people insane. It was weird. It was like
Indie Illuminati.
No, yeah, and then people go crazy with that shit. It's weird, and they get so upset about it, and they just, I don't know, they just rage silently on their computers somewhere, and it's like, hey, it's just a bunch of dudes. That's a really interesting thing that's happened recently. Not recently, but over like the last 4 or 5 years. A bunch of people that I'm good friends with have made things that are extremely popular. So like Tommy Refinez is a really dear friend of mine, and we put together a box of like chicken nuggets and sent it to him when he was at the end of Meat Boy because he had no money left and was like starving. And it was like, okay, that's Tommy. That's like our really good friend. And then now all of a sudden it's Indie Game the movie. It's Meat Boy. He's fine financially. Better than fine, and he's quite well known. He can't really go to trade shows or game developer events anymore without just being hassled all the time. Which is
that true? Hassled in a negative way, or just in like you're a popular and famous person way?
Well, that's the thing, right? We're all just a bunch of weirdo introverts. So when you have that spotlight shown on you, and a lot of people come and talk to you from the point of view of not like, hey, I'm a developer, I want to meet another developer, but from like, oh my God, you're the famous Tommy Refinez or whatever. I don't know. It seems like a recipe for discomfort.
Certainly.
It's a problem, right? And I've seen it firsthand, which is really interesting because it definitely creates a barrier. Like you have to put up some kind of barrier. You can't just talk to random people anymore, and so it makes you kind of cagey. Like you don't want to go out when you know people are going to recognize you, and I don't know, it's weird. But the really interesting thing about that is like, okay, so I know Tommy, and I've known Kyle Gabler and Ron Carmel since before World of Goo was the biggest game ever, and I've known John Blow since before Braid came out and that sort of thing. All of those guys are just dudes doing their thing, making what they want to make, and caring about making good work and that sort of thing. And they're all still the same people they were, more or less, just with more resources. And so if you look at someone like a famous actor, or you look at a famous film director or an author, like whoever your favorite author is or whatever, they're just people, and that's the thing that you realize when you watch someone go from just being just like me, making stuff and struggling with it and just trying to express myself the way best I can, to like a huge vaunted success that everyone on the internet thinks is successful or whatever. There's really no difference, and so those people are just people, and you could talk to them if you talk to them as a person and not as like a famous person.
I mean, I think go ahead.
Because I would say I'm acquaintances with Notch.
Yeah.
I mean, I've like hung out with him a fair few times, and I know him, and we when we go to Sweden we hang out with him a couple of times usually. And his life is just crazy now. Like his phone rings all the time, and it's just kids who've somehow found his phone number, and they're just like, "Was that a Notch? Oh my God, it's a Notch!" And so he like looks at his phone, and if it's not someone in his contacts, he just hands it to a guy that he's in the employ of him, and the guy like answers it and takes care of it.
That's
He doesn't want to be
hilarious.
a dick, right? Yeah, most people would.
No.
Notch is a really nice guy, but I mean, yeah, I mean, he's still just a dude. I remember. Okay, I'm off on like a crazy tangent spill, but if we're talking about TIG source, I
Yeah,
remember
sure.
when Notch posted the very first version of Minecraft to the TIG IRC channel. And, you know, there's like 50 people in there or something, and he posted the very first version of it, and we all grabbed it, or some of us did, and we looked at it like, oh, this is cool, you know, walk around this voxel world, you got some trees, it's sort of generative. There's nothing to do, there was no combat, there was no mining yet.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, that's kind of cool, and then, you know, a few months
Yeah.
later, he posted another one, and like, oh, there's like zombies now, that's pretty cool. And then a year later, I see like a post on Kotaku or something, it's like, indie game sells 1 million copies from website. I'm like, what the fuck just happened?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I mean, that whole, there was an interesting discussion about that, which I think parallels this topic about somebody, I can't remember what site it was on, maybe Polygon, just recently wrote an article about, you know, the myth of the kind of indie megastar, and people like, especially Notch, right, because he's like the weird, freakish kind of situation of having made so much money with this weird game, but
Yeah.
how it's kind of like a weird kind of warping influence, or is it, or whatever. I mean, I think it's interesting. It's kind of funny for me to hear, because I guess a unique situation, just because you're dealing with, as you say, kind of like people who are used to being introverted in their bedrooms and just like, you know, talking to computers, not to other humans, and then they're kind of being cast in this celebrity kind of mode.
I mean, there's a really good definition of introversion versus extroversion that I heard. It's from a book or something, but somebody told it to me secondhand. But it's basically, you're an extrovert if you gain energy by talking to other people, and you're an introvert if you lose energy. So, like, if you're an introvert, maybe you like hanging out with people and talking to them and being friends, but then you need to go home and, like, have your self-time and be chilled out. And, like, that's definitely me, and that's definitely most people that I know who are indie devs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true of most people who spend lots and lots of time by themselves working. You know, if you're a writer or certain types of musicians, you know, I mean, I'm certainly the same way. You know, I do love talking to people, and I love connecting and communicating, but then exactly, I need to go be alone, you know, for many hours, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's how I kind of relax. So it's a funny, I mean, the whole, I mean, obviously we're off on a deep tangent, but I enjoy deep tangents, and it's my show, so whatever. But it's funny especially I think with indie games, the kind of, and I think it's a cool thing, the fact that people are identifying games with people, you know, and that they're like, this guy, like Notch, made Minecraft by himself, you know, and it's, people are kind of, that idea of authorship, I think, is getting a lot more play because it's these like smaller teams, or you know, and things like Indie Game the Movie and stuff.
So, okay, I'm gonna make myself sound really old now, but this is interesting. So I went to my first game developers conference in 1999, and at that time it was all just AAA, whatever, shooters and titties and titty girls and whatever. Even worse than it was today. It was like, let's put a titty girl on the back of a dragon with a sword, and that's the whole game. 3 or 4, 6 years later. No, it wasn't even that many. It was like 5 years later. John Blow and Chris Hecker and Casey Mertzori and Admin Binstock, and I think Chaim Jingle was there too. They came and gave this talk about the experimental gameplay session, and that was when the first one of those happened. And the point of that was, hey, everybody, we're steering this ship in a direction where it's going to crash into what they call the comics ghetto. People used to talk about that all the time, where comics kind of have this chance to be a real artistic medium, but then they, by being puerile, drove themselves into this little ghetto that they could never escape from. So they got up there and they were like, hey, everybody, let's think about how to actually advance the craft of game design. And that just kicked off this revolution that's kind of come to fruition like maybe 3-4 years ago in the last few years. and it's really come around. Part of that whole argument and problem, and a thing that people were just talking about all the time, I mean, like 3 or 4 talks per year back in like the early aughts, was how do we attribute authorship for games? Like, where can we put on the box that this is the game designer of this game? Because we want people to know that. We want proper attribution for our work, and that this is still a big problem with, like, whatever, who made Grand Theft Auto and who made Halo and stuff. Nobody knows. But Notch, I would argue, is the first legitimate superstar video game designer. I mean, he was on a serious talk show, like.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And
like Craig Ferguson. And so it's like that dream has come to fruition as well, and it's been really fascinating to watch it go from that one sort of modest session with John and Chris with these ideas that at the time were radical to like the next generation, which was people like Kyle Gabler and Kyle Gray, making little prototypes at Carnegie Mellon, which kicked off this whole game jam thing. I mean, Chris and John invented the idea of game jam.
That's crazy.
That wasn't a thing. They showed up at this experimental gameplay session and they were like, hey, we came up with this crazy idea. It's called Game Jam. We did a game jam. The idea was we take this crazy piece of technology where you can render 1 million sprites, and then we had all our friends make a crazy game in like a weekend. And they showed all these crazy games that they made, and everybody's like, wow. But that was when game jams became a thing. Like, that was when game jams existed for the very first time. And so now if you fast forward until now.
When was that?
I believe that was 2004.
Okay.
I believe. I'd have to go back and look at it because I've been to so many game developers conferences at this point. But it's been really fascinating to watch it go through and basically become realized. So they used to run the experimental gameplay workshop every year, and then 3 years ago they just said, you know what, we don't need to do this anymore.
Wow. What
we wanted to do has been accomplished, so we're not going to do it anymore. So that it was taken over by Robin Hunicke and Dan Ben-Mergi and Chris. Yeah, it's just been really fascinating to watch that become a thing, and like all these ideas really come to fruition. I don't think that happens that often. So I mean, I think you could argue that we're in a period of revolution that hasn't happened in any major medium for a long time. Like, it's really becoming. It's really, we're seeing this revolution in game creation, and it's really an exciting time to be making games.
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, and it's a huge part of the reason why I kind of chose to shift my own artistic major focus to sort of game development, along with the fact I think that we're seeing the rise of tools like Unity and GameMaker and all this kind of stuff, where, because I've been wanting to make games for 10 years or something, but just not having had a strong programming background, I would kind of start and then, start learning C or C++ and just struggle, and then like try to make a calculator and fail, and then like.
I can't do C++. If Unity didn't exist, I wouldn't be able to make games for sure. And there's a lot of people. I'm
certainly that way. Because I tried at many stages. I tried with Torque, and Torque came out, and I couldn't quite get over. And part of that is just my own motivation. I had other stuff going on. I was doing music, but like. I really wanted to do it, and it wasn't until Unity kind of got to the level that it was at that I was able to kind of get over the hump and now actually be able to like make some stuff that it sort of represents what I want to make. And so I feel like there's a really interesting convergence between the kind of cultural side of this kind of recognition of authorship, and then the technical side of the things like Unity being free or mostly free.
That was something that the guys were talking about back when they first introduced the experimental gameplay sessions. They were saying, like, a lot of people were talking about this too. It's like, well, the reason why there aren't indie games, or there aren't games made by single auteurs that are really meaningful in advancing the craft, is because there aren't tools that democratize game creation enough. And it's funny because John is famous for saying that if you use a garbage collected language, you're not serious about game development.
Good.
but then he loves Spelunky, which was made in GameMaker, so I don't know what he's talking about.
Right. Well, that's like classic kind of. I mean, and that's actually a really interesting, like, historical or whatever you want to call it thread or trend to consider is that in the past, the only people who were allowed to speak in the medium were people like John Blow, who is like a journeyman programmer, and then you had someone like Derek Yu, who is not, a sort of a deep level programmer, but can kind of work with a tool like GameMaker and is kind of conversant with game design. I don't want to minimize Derek Yu's programming skills, but he's not like a computer scientist.
I don't think you're minimizing Derek. I think you're minimizing everyone else who makes games, because Derek has a CS degree from Berkeley.
Okay, I didn't know
Derek
that.
really knows how to program, but Derek's a goddamn freak genius.
Yeah, that's funny. I didn't know that. I thought he was.
He's an amazing artist, an amazing, like, really good programmer, and
just
also
a monster.
He's
basically.
he's just an unbelievable game designer. Like, his instincts are so comically good. Like, just like, yeah, man, I'm just gonna make this game. I was sitting next to him at we ran a game jam called Tig Jam that was in Arizona for a few years. It still runs every year. It's in like Mountain View now. Okay, this is me. I'm sitting here working on my game. To the left of me is Adam Saltzman, and he's making Cannibal. And to the right of me is Derek, and he's making Spelunky. I'm just like, fuck you guys. I can
Don't.
Yeah. Derek's just a... Don't ever compare yourself to Derek, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, then you just feel sad.
That way lies madness.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yes. No, I mean, well, my point that I failed to make there was that I think we're seeing a point where, insert person who does not have a CS degree here who's making games. In the past you had to be a pretty hardcore programmer or have access to one to make anything, and now you don't.
I mean,
so we
get
totally a range of voices.
He used GameMaker because it was really fast and easy to do, and really anybody could have made Spelunky. Like, he put the source online if you want to look at it.
Yeah. It's
really not a complicated program at all. Like, even the way he's doing level generation is way simpler than a lot of people do level generation. Like,
yeah.
And the result is really good. So it's like, okay, well, yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel like that, right? It's like I spent the last week making this game, and it has a ton of menus, and it's super complex, and there's a bunch of interlocking systems, and I just fucking hacked the shit out of it. Like, it's terrible. Like, the code is a nightmare. I would never want anyone else to read it, but it works, right? And so it's like, well, whatever. Like, nobody cares what the code looks like if the game works, and that's kind of where we are with tools now. It's like, Hotline Miami is made in GameMaker. Nobody cares, and one of the reasons...
Incredible game. I actually caught, like, I got it on Vita and just played through it like a week or two ago, and just, whoa.
So good. And that's a great example
good.
Of an art style that was easy to execute, but is extremely different and stylish, and,
incredible music selection.
Well, a lot of those tracks were written just for that game, too. It just
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it just so happens that Cactus knows a lot of people who are really good at writing music. A lot of those people who wrote those tracks are like game designers by trade too.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. It's funny because no, go ahead.
Like 3 of my favorite tracks on there are by the guy who did Lone Survivor.
No way.
Yeah.
That's wild, because I remember reading some interview where he was like, oh, yeah, we just found some people on Bandcamp and licensed the tracks, and I was like, what?
Oh, yeah, I guess some of them must be that then. I know at least like 4 or 5 of them were written just for the game. Yeah. Or maybe they weren't written for the game, maybe they're just written, but I know they were written by like game designers.
By, like friends of his.
I'm listening to this song and I'm like, wait a minute. You're not a musician. Why is this so good? I'm like, well, apparently you are a musician.
Yeah, it turns out you are. Yeah, no, I mean, that was just, and what I really, obviously the kinetic feel of the game and the control and everything is amazing, and the difficulty and stuff, but I loved it's got this kind of like Lynchian sort of atmosphere about it, with all the like, it just keeps getting weirder, and this kind of unexplained weirdness, and layering that with this kind of twitchy shooter thing, I thought was just the music, the visual aesthetic, and then this kind of just really surreal narrative, I just thought was very impressive.
Dude, yeah, that game is fantastic. It's crazy. Yeah, but that's Cactus for you, right? Cactus is, I don't know how you describe him. He's kind of like Jackson Pollock. Like, the act of creation for him is so spontaneous. Like, he's famous for making a game in like 4 hours or whatever.
Yeah, no, I know his reputation a little bit. I don't know that much about him. I just know that he made like 1 million tiny weird games, and people would joke like, "Oh, while you were sleeping, he made 2 games." And
Right. Yeah. While you were asleep, Cactus made 5 games. But I think that's actually an intentional part of his practice, or at least he's evolved a craft that is driven by that. So like, he doesn't program super well, and just like I don't program super well. Although yeah, I think he's better at programming poorly than I do in terms of like, just here's an idea in my brain before I have a chance to overthink it or fuck with it, blam, it's in the computer and it's a thing. And so I think that kind of speed of being able to get the idea out there leads to that weird freshness and like the way the mechanics, the story, and all that stuff wrap together. I mean, I think that's just a result of the way that he builds games, and I think you can do that with like a carefully thought out, carefully crafted narrative and mechanics and how they all fit together. But I think it's not the only way to do that. I think it's been the default way to do that because of what we were talking about earlier, where programming and making games is really hard. But now that tools like GameMaker are coming out, you start to see people on the fringes like Cactus who basically take GameMaker and use it like a spray can to do graffiti in games.
Yeah, I love that metaphor actually, and I agree that there's a very kind of gestural or fresh kind of feel to it that I love the way that you describe that, because that's something that I think, it's a mode of expression I very much believe in, that the kind of the unfiltered, kind of just, edgy, not super refined in a, I mean, I'm not going to say it's not refined. That's not a great word, but not overthought or overcooked,
Right, and that's really, really hard to do with a game, I think.
Exactly, yeah, and I mean, I think that hopefully now in the kind of historical circumstance, we're going to see more in that direction, which I think is super, super interesting.
It's interesting to imagine what like the next set of tools beyond Unity will be like, or the one beyond that. Even if it's just the same, it's Unity 10 or whatever it is, like how much easier can you make it for people to make games but still be able to do all the parts that are really expressive? Because I know there's a lot of really smart people. This is probably a good segue into talking about teaching stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really smart people making things like Kodu and Scratch and Logo Writer and things like that in an attempt to make it really easy to make things. But there's a line that gets crossed, I think, where after a while you're drawing with crayons on construction paper, where it's like it's so safe and constrained that real artistic expression kind of goes out the window. Maybe crayons is a bad metaphor because you can do great drawings with crayons and stuff, but you know what I'm saying. Like at some
I know
point,
exactly what you mean. The medium limits the expression that's possible within it. I know. I think that's a really interesting challenge for anybody who's trying to make tools, is to not over-determine the output. Like every tool kind of wants you to make certain things. Like it kind of pushes you in the direction of like, you see people who are just learning to use Photoshop, and it's like, oh, filters. let's posterize everything
all day long. Emboss, twist.
Exactly. Twirl. Spherize. Yeah, which will be its own kind of like set of stylistic gestures 20 years from now. People are like, yes, the early twirl period of graphic design. But yeah, I mean that's definitely an interesting. This is apropos. Well, it's related. When I was about 15, I was teaching myself 3D modeling. I had an internship at a video production company in New York, and I used to read 3D Artist magazine back then, and this would have been 19 years ago now. Yeah. There was a great little tutorial in there they were like, make your model out of clay first, or anything but in a 3D program, so that when you get to your 3D program, you have to kind of look at the model and be like, I'm going to make this, even though I want to just make a sphere, and put like a sunset on it, because that's what a 3D program like really wants to do, Right. Be like, no, you have to make this fucked up looking clay thing, because you've kind of committed to it's kind of keeping you honest and not just like letting the tool kind of railroad you into making like a sphere and a sunset, Excuse my cursing, anybody who's offended.
I don't give a shit.
Yeah, I'll have to label it
Yeah,
explicit in
I
iTunes.
mean, we work from home, so we have no incentive to cultivate manners of any kind.
That's true, or wear clothes.
Yeah. Actually, I have no pants on right now.
See, there you go.
Not sure you saw me go.
Now everybody knows.
Now everybody.
But so something you started, you gracefully set up a segue. You graceful guest, which is something I would like to talk about, is your teaching practice.
Sure.
You taught game design for 8 years, is that right?
Yep. So I taught at the Art Institute of Phoenix, which has a program called Gameplay and Game Design. But actually, the class was called Gameplay. It was like game art and design was the major. And so I provided the design part of that. So I had 3 or sometimes 4 classes in a sequence that would teach game design, which I appropriated that to teach system design. So I'd make all the kids make board games. Because I don't think anybody realizes how hard it is to make a good board game. It's kind of like naked game design. It takes away all the bells and whistles. It takes away the ability to put a sunrise on a sphere, the version of that's video games. Like if you can control something in real time and it feels good and it moves around and it's shiny graphics and stuff, that buys you a lot as far as engagement goes. So if you take that away and now you have a group of 4 people sitting around a bunch of little plastic tokens and a piece of paper, and you want to make those people have a really enjoyable experience, an experience that is better than what they could get playing a game online. Well, that's a real challenge, and that's real game design. So I have the kids, they designed 6 board games across the course of the class, which was 11 weeks, so it's, can't give them, I don't give them enough time to overthink it, and I don't give them enough time to like rat hole on sculpting little pieces out of clay or something like that, because a lot of them are artists and that's what they want to do. Yeah, I had them play a lot of really good games. Not very many people who've played a lot of good board games, which is interesting to me, although that's changing. But I mean, the number of people who played Settlers of Catan in my classes over the course of 8 years is probably like 4.
Wow.
I know, right? It's like you think of that because we're nerds or whatever, and we play board games. You think of that as like a thing that everyone does, but it's just not. So I make them play Carcassonne, and I make them play, there's Reiner Knizia game called Modern Art, which is one of my favorites. I don't know if you played that.
I don't know that one, no.
It has speaking of bad graphic design, it's like every bad graphic design, it's like every Photoshop filter. It's the ugliest game in the world. Although I think they have a new version of it that's better, but the old one that I have is so butt ugly. But it's a fantastic game. It's like a weird systemic simulation of how and why things become popular.
Oh, interesting. Ooh, that's cool.
It's really gorgeous. It's gorgeously designed. But anyway, so I torture these poor kids by making them make board games, and by the time they come out of it, one person out of the whole class usually is like, that was awesome, I want to be a game designer, and everyone else is like, fuck game design.
Like, I'm going to go be an artist.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So then I have a class, I have 2 level design classes that I used to teach, which are fun. So it used to be like, let's draw levels on paper and stuff. And we're like, no, we're gonna make levels. So I had everyone make levels for Super Mario Kart and Mario World and Tony Hawk Underground. There's a game called Soldat. I don't know if you ever played it. It's like a indie multiplayer shooter. It's one of my favorite online games. It's really good. It's really high skill.
Interesting.
Counter-Strike, Portal, just make a ton of levels for a bunch of different games, and then playtesting is really part of the craft and the practice, right? And that's the thing with the board games as well, is that I tell everybody not to get too hung up on so the thing that happens, that I've seen happen with people who are starting to design games, when you sit them down and say, okay, design a game, first they're just like, I don't know, and then they glom onto the first thing that they know, so they make Monopoly. So I outlaw all race games and all use of dice for the first game. So no going around a track, and no using dice of any kind, because they just don't understand how to use randomness enough to not just have a game where you just roll the dice and move and there's no skill at all.
Candyland.
Yeah, and so the testing is the part of it that makes you understand how the game is actually functioning. And so people, when you turn them loose, even if you give them a focus, like I want you to make it a game that has 3 resources, they just go inside themselves and just make themselves miserable, imagining the way that people are going to play their game over and over again, and they just get so spun up and hung up on this idea, like, I don't know what to do, and I'm like, okay, well, what do you got? and they usually have like a theme and then a couple of ideas for mechanics. Like, okay, well let's make it out of paper right now, and let's grab a couple people and let's play it. And it's like immediately, because it's so painful to do that, right? It's so painful to have someone play your game. It's just excruciating if you've never done that. I mean, most people haven't even considered that as a possibility, even people who play a lot of games. Like, I've made a game and then I have to watch people fuck it up. No, you have to watch.
You're
people
not playing it right. You're not
right.
playing it right.
No, and people do that, and I gently guide them away from doing that. And so, the testing is really the key. And I know, if you get into more advanced realms of game design, there are different schools of thought about, like, you shouldn't test that much if you have a good enough instinct as a designer. You don't want the test to pollute what you're creating, and you definitely don't want to just do whatever people tell you to do. But I mean, I think when you're starting out, you just have to kind of take that scientific approach, because you just have no idea, and you're going to rat hole in your brain about what's going on. So testing all the time, testing with people. Testing with people that you know is not as good as testing with people that you don't know, and testing with people that you're in the same room with them has a very strong psychological effect that you'd love to be able to control for. So I think doing like a replay and recording system for your game is actually really beneficial. Even just like each time someone gets a star or finishes a level or whatever it is in your game, if you just keep track of those, if you just save that data and upload it so that you can have some kind of picture of the way that people are playing your game when no one is watching. That's a different tangent. That's talking about actual game design. But yeah, so that's what I do when I teach, is like I try to pull them into having to care about the way that their levels and games function when people are actually playing them.
I think
that's the key to everything that I do. I
think that's an awesome piece of advice. I feel like and it runs counter to a lot of what you'll read. I had Noel Berry on the show a couple episodes ago, actually on the first episode, and we were talking about prototyping versus game design documents, obviously talking about video games. And a lot of places, even books that you read, will be like, the first thing you need to do is write a 14-page game design document. And it's just like, and having read those things, I like sat down and I was like, yeah, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and write like 40 pages of notes, because I love to write, and I'll just sit and write. And then you get there and you build the first mechanic, and you're like, oh, that doesn't work. None of the other stuff works. It's like everything that was stacked on top of that is now in the garbage can.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, Noel's particularly good at prototyping stuff. The whole Vancouver indie set, those guys are all beasts. Like Alex, Chevy, Matt Thorson, Noel, like all those guys are just monstrosities. But yeah, so yeah, I think it really depends on the type of game you're making. So if you're gonna make Civ 5 or Sins of a Solar Empire or something that requires a huge amount of system design and work before you can even test whether or not it functions, like there's no point in making like a little farmer guy that walks around a hex grid. I mean, you're going to have to do that to make Civ. But if then you say, like, okay, well, we need to test this walking around a grid mechanic, right? That makes no sense. So it really depends on the type of game you're making. There's some games that require just a huge amount of initial investment just to build a version of it that will work. The ultimate expression of that is MMOs, which are just a fucking nightmare. Like, to even test whether or not your MMO works, you need to build so much technology and so many assets and have so many systems and have them work in so many ways. This is a nightmare. So yeah, I think that if you look at the games that a lot of people are creating today, people are straying towards things that are really safe in terms of you can build it and you can test it really quickly. It's not a huge amount of system design overhead up front just to test whether or not the game is good. So that's the kind of thing that like Noel and Alec and those guys make. Stuff that I won't say it's easy, because there's a huge amount of energy that goes into it, and those guys are beastly. Like, I don't know if you've seen Night in the Woods. Yeah. Do you know that Alec worked on that for 3 months?
Is that it?
Yeah.
Fuck.
I know. I was like, God damn it, Alec. You're so good at everything. I hate you.
Yeah.
Yeah, Alec and Scott together are like an unbelievable dream team. But yeah, so I think that for those kinds of things, a game design document might not be bad. I don't believe in doing documents because I think that linear paragraphs of text don't are not a good way to explain complex interrelationships. So I have a particular format that I make all my students create their designs in. So it's basically it's from systems theory. Have you ever read Rules of Play?
No.
With Eric Zimmerman, Katie Salen. It has a lot of it's a really long book and it has a lot of I would say academic tangents. So, but there's a lot of really good stuff in there. Anyway, he has a description of systems theory, and he says that basics. One of the basic ideas of systems theory is that you can look at any system and say, okay, so you have agents, and then you have let's see, I'm getting the language wrong, but I can tell it to you later. But it's so basically you have like an actor, which is like the node in the graph or whatever, and then you have like connections from one actor to another, and there are different types and different ways those connections can happen. There are attributes that can live on those actors. So an actor can have as many different types of attributes as you want, and that whole system, all those actors and those connections all live in an environment. It's kind of a backdrop. So it's like, okay, let's look at your design. What are the main actors in the game? Okay, this is like a samurai game. All right, so the actors are the samurais. Okay, what kind of attributes do they have? Well, they have health and they have damage that they do or whatever. Really simple.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the connections between them? Like, how are you going to connect one to another? And so what happens, especially with the board games, is that they'll come up with this idea and they get really stuck. And like, oh, you're like mobsters and you're like competing for territory and like, but I don't know what to do. And like, okay, well, let's sit down and draw it. Okay, so here's your mobster, and here's another mobster, and here's some more mobsters. And you said there are city blocks? Yeah, okay, so then here's a city block, so here's a bit of a city block. All right, so what's the relationship between these guys and those guys? Okay, well, I guess they can capture those. All right. And then what does that give them? Oh, I don't know. Well, like why would you want to capture them? Oh, well, I guess it could like give you money every turn. Like, all right. And then if you move the guy off of there, then you don't get the money. And if two mobsters like move on at the same spot, then they fight. Okay, well, like how do they fight? Well, I could roll a dice, but then there's no skill. So then how would you relate the fighting? Well, like maybe they can buy each other off, or it's like who has more money, or like you can buy people randomly from the town. You can like hire them to fight or whatever. And so like you make this like grid of connections, and you try to connect things more than one time. I think that's kind of like the main thing that I see early game design students doing. It's like if you have these actors and they're only connected by one line, the system is not interesting.
Yeah.
But if you have them woven together so that each actor provides many different functions in the game, then I think it starts to become interesting. At least that's an element I see that's common between good games.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. Like I just read the first half of it, but Anna Anthropy's game design, a vocabulary of game design.
Is that a new book she just did?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure it's new. I think she gave you a thank you note in it, actually.
Really? Holy shit.
Which you'll be happy to hear.
No, I didn't know that. I should check it out.
It's her. I think it's her and I want to say Naomi Clark, but that might be the wrong person.
Could be Naomi, yeah.
Yes, and so she has a very interesting piece of language in there where she's like, okay, if we're thinking about using a kind of a narrative metaphor for a game, we have characters who are, let's say, people in our platform, let's say Mario in our platform game, but the things that kind of develop over time, the way a character would develop in a novel, are the verbs. Right. So this kind of idea of layering or treating a character as a verb, and this I was just like head explode, amazing, because what it allowed me to then do was to bring in. I've read a lot about writing fiction and stuff because there's been times where I'm going to be a novelist, and then I was like, no, this is way too hard. But there was this book I read about writing novels, and they're like, to make your characters interesting, you layer your characters. You know what I mean? So it's like your love interest is also the villain. And it's like, oh, that's more interesting than having a love interest and a villain who, the love interest sits at home and loves you, and the villain is antagonistic. It's like, no, it's the same person. And I loved that. Just kind of like clicked for me using that metaphor, and it kind of, I sort of hear some of what you're saying there in the same light, that it's like if if you have these kind of layered interactions, then you can start to have these, different dynamics kind of emerge or whatever.
If you haven't gone and read some of like the classic literature about game design stuff, I think, as far as I know, the first mention of verbs as a useful thing to think about for game design is Chris Crawford. And he has a lot of really interesting things to say about verbs, but he has this whole idea about data intensity versus process intensity. The synopsized version is a computer is for processing things, so if you make a CD-ROM game that's just a movie that plays back and you press a button every once in a while, that's a fundamental misuse of the medium. And he kind of goes to the extreme and says that any game that has more process intensity is a better game, but whatever. But
that's kind of what he does, right? He's always kind of
extreme
provoking people.
He's a brilliant guy. I really recommend Chris Crawford on game design. That's one of my favorite game design books ever.
That's the title?
Yeah. If you don't, a lot of people can't read it because they get annoyed with Chris Crawford being.
No,
Chris
I'm actually a fan of his. I like his provocative nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't agree with a lot of his ideas, but
sure.
I'm really happy that he had them, and I'm really happy that I read them. Anyway, so verbs. His big thing is like, okay, so games are a medium about processing input and feeding back results. And so when you design a game, the first thing that you should think about isn't the story or the setting or the artwork or the characters. The first thing you should think about is what are the verbs. And one of his main points is like, okay, in Mario, there's very few verbs, right? It's like walk, run, jump, duck. That's all the verbs. But if you look at something like Civ or something, there's like move, and then there's like till field, and then there's like start settlement and forge treaty, and fire missile, and like there's hundreds of verbs. So his point is that if you're going to design a game, the first thing that you should design is the verbs. What does the player do? Like, what are the actual activities that the player will do? And I think that's a really good tool for kind of cutting down to what is the experience you're trying to create.
Yeah, no, I love that as a suggestion, and that's something that one of the, I had this project. It was kind of like the first in this past year that I've kind of like pushed myself harder on game development and design. This was kind of the one big project that I was working on, and what I realized at a certain point was I had like one, real verb, and I had no way to develop it. I basically designed like one level, and I was like, man, that's it. Like, there's no way to I was like, level 2 looks different, but there's no other like interesting way to evolve this in terms of the interactivity. And that was when I kind of realized, I was like, oh, okay, I've sort of painted myself into a corner.
Gotta know when to fold them.
What's that?
You gotta know when to fold them.
Yeah, which is actually a interesting thing to talk about, maybe, because it's the whole like sunk costs idea is like you get so attached to something, you're like, but I spent so much time on this, and it's like, but it sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. That exists in music and art and writing. It doesn't matter what it is. That's just part of being a creative person, right? It's like you have to control for that, and there's just this effect where you love stuff that you made.
Yeah, exactly. You're totally blind.
Yeah, I had an art teacher who came in for the first day of class, and he's like, "All right, so class is on Wednesday again next week, and what I want you to do is I want you to take a photograph, and I want you to render it in graphite pencil on nice paper as realistically as you possibly can, and I want you to come back with that next week." So you come back next week with this drawing that you slaved on for a week, and there's just erasers sitting on everyone's desk. And he's like, all right, now erase your picture. And then he would hang all the erased pictures on the wall.
Oh! And what was the like? Don't become attached. Is that the lesson? What's the explanation?
Yeah, that's the lesson. Don't do that. And there were a few girls in the class, and one of them was just bawling, and this guy like grabbed his picture and ran out and never came back. Like, well, this is kind of a test about whether or not you're cut out to be an artist.
Damn. Oh, yeah, it's good.
I thought that was pretty brilliant. Yeah.
That's really brilliant. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, no, it's talking about learning. I think anything, because I teach as well, and I've been teaching music production for many years, and it's something it's a classic mistake that I see people making where they start one project. And then everything they learn, they add to that project, and then they get stuck, and then they just like sit with that project for long periods of time, And what that causes people to lose is that rapid repetition, and like just like start again, do something new, start again, and that I find is the way people get better much faster. Whereas it's like the opposite. You're sitting with this project and you're just like listening to it and feeling depressed and getting unmotivated, and it's not getting better, but partly because you're holding on to the first thing you did, and it sucks.
Yeah.
There's no,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
it's
that's
like
a great lesson.
The Adventure Time 3 seconds or whatever it is that's been made into a million GIFs everywhere. It's like sucking at something is the first step towards being good at something. It's like Jake is saying that to Finn.
Yeah, and I mean that's a really important lesson for people to internalize. And it's funny because I know that so closely from teaching music, but then I basically went and did the same thing when I started teaching myself game design. Like worked for 8 months on this game where I like realized I was like, oh no, this sucks. And I mean,
the thing I recommend for people, I recommend 2 things for people who are serious about making games and really want to learn and get good at it fast. The first thing is to pick your favorite arcade game and clone it. Just clone Arkanoid or Joust or something. Whatever your favorite arcade game is, clone it. And when I say clone it, I mean like do sound and do title screens and do menus and like do everything. Just clone it and finish it, and don't show it to anyone. It doesn't matter. But just do that, and then you know how to make a game. And if you do, you can try to make your own game after that. But I really would recommend doing that like 3 or 4 times, or at least like make games that are kind of variants, like save things that you understand, but like complete them and finish them, and try to push into some directions you haven't done, like do something with physics or whatever you're interested in doing eventually. That's totally not what I did, and that's not what anybody does. But
that's brutal.
If I try to save
that's
people
so
pain,
hard.
yeah, if I'm trying to save people pain, that's what I tell them to do. But the other thing that I recommend, and this works regardless, is there's a book called C# 5.0 in a nutshell, C# 4.0 in a nutshell. Any of those, that series. Buy that. It's a big, fat, thick brick of a book. Start at the first chapter and read like the first 10 chapters. And it's dry, and it's boring, and it's shitty. But as you read it, go and like try to make little things that implement what you're learning about the syntax of the language. And it's like bitter medicine, but you'll come out the other end, and you'll be so much better. Because even if you can't use all the concepts that you learn, whenever you look at a new piece of code, you won't be confused. You'll be like, why? Okay, wait a minute. Why is there like a colon and then 2 variables with a question mark in between it? Like, what does this syntax mean? You're like, okay, well, I know what that is, and then you can try to figure out what's going on. That's one of the things that I find that it's really a barrier for people when they get into it, is like the syntax, and especially people feel like the computer is giving them a middle finger every time it won't compile. And it's like once you're past that, you can keep going, keep learning. But I think the most efficient way to do it is to read that book. Read a proper reference. That's the best one that I've come across, a proper language reference, so you know what is available to you.
That's a super valuable suggestion. I've actually just kind of set that project for myself of being like, after I started with JavaScript and Unity and kind of got to a certain point with that, and I was like, okay, I need to learn C#, and then switch to C#, and now, I mean, I can do some stuff in C#, like a bunch of stuff, but yeah, like somebody was asking me like, what's polymorphism? And I'm like, like just don't know. So, getting that, I kind of realized, I was like, okay, I have a bunch of blanks that I need to fill in, and so that's actually kind of like one of my next projects. So that's a really useful suggestion.
One thing that I've had a lot of success with is if you're using C#, C# was the language for X and A. So pretty much anything that you want to do in a game system, somebody's already done it in C#, either for Unity or more likely for XNA. So like just Google the thing you want to do. Like I want to have weapons with different parameters, and I want to like have them all extend from one class so I can change things or whatever. It's like somebody's already done that, and you can find an example. If you've read the language reference and you know all the syntax, then you can figure out what the hell's going on. I don't know. It's really useful.
That's a great point. No, and I mean, would you recommend that? So, kind of, let's say, I'm total noob 1128, and I'm saying, hey, I want to make games. Would you say go learn C# and Unity?
Yeah, that's one way you could do it. I mean, it depends what you want to make, right? For whatever reason, most of the ideas that I have are in 3D, so Unity makes a lot of sense. If you really want to make like 2D platformers or something, I don't know how much sense Unity makes. Like, I think you're better off doing Game Maker or something where you can get up and get running faster in a 2D environment. You make it a lot easier on yourself. The Unity 2D stuff is just not mature or robust enough.
Yeah. Although they've made a big kind of push into it now with their new releases, but I agree, there's still not as much sort of stuff out there online documenting it and so on.
Well, they need a proper tile collision engine built in. It's not reasonable to expect someone to write that from scratch. I mean, even if you can, right? Like, it's better if they just have it because it's such an obvious common thing that everyone would want, and they could do a really good job with it, and they could have like curved surfaces and slopes and everything, and have it all work really well. And then a huge number of people would just be able to make the game they want without having to dick around. Because right now it's like box 2D in Unity, and it's really hard to make something feel good to control. Like, it's really hard to make something feel responsive by using a box 2D object. Like, that's advanced physics, game design, and tuning. But that's what there is. That's all there is. So it's really frustrating for people, I think.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool. And then, so it's a good, speaking of game feel, you wrote a book.
I did.
Which, is titled Game Feel. And which I admit I have not read the whole thing. I started reading it when we scheduled our interview and got a good way in.
It's pretty dense. Yeah.
It's dense, but I mean, I have to say, for those, if you're interested in reading it, listening to the show, I do recommend it. I like the kind of basic definitions you're starting from, and I thought it was illuminating for me, kind of breaking apart certain things, which I'm sure some people would kind of get upset about, but being like, dividing the idea of real-time direct control from something like StarCraft or Dota, where it's like click and the guy goes here. That was kind of an interesting thought, and it's definitely something that chimes with my kind of intuitive experience. It's just a different kind of pleasure, like flying a car in Wipeout as opposed to clicking a guy in StarCraft.
Yeah, I just think you're never gonna click to move your guy in Dota and like lean your head to try and get him to move faster. So I wanted to draw that as a dividing line.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting division to draw, and it definitely, and some of the discussion that you had about just the fact that controlling something like that can be its own kind of intuitive pleasure. And that is, I think, a big part of what makes video games specifically as different from, let's say, board games, besides like Hungry Hippos or something.
Well, I mean, okay, but even if you look at board games, feel is very important. Like the sound that poker chips make when you...
Oh, interesting.
The feel of playing cards and like the feel of good dice. All of those have evolved to be really positive and recognizable feels and sounds.
That's an interesting point, yeah.
There is some feel design to, it's not like real-time control, right? Because reality, playing games about real-time control in reality is just like pool and soccer or whatever, right? But yeah, I think that sound that things make and the feel of them when you pick them up, like it's weird how you can really tell the difference between like nice poker chips and like cheap plastic ones. even if they look the same, you can really feel the difference, whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
I talk about this in the book. People made a big deal about the feel of the PlayStation 3 controller when it first came out because it was too light and the plastic felt cheap.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think it's a cool thing. I think it's one of the things that people, I don't know, may or may not be so aware of as one of the challenges, definitely of real-time game design, but it's something you really encounter, especially if you're trying to do anything, well, any kind of game that involves kind of game feel in your definition, that if it doesn't feel good to move around, it's just
dead in the water.
It's rough. Yeah, it's just like, and the skill of tuning that and tweaking that, it was something I found myself spending a lot of time on with my sort of game that I was working on, and it turns out I really enjoy doing, but it was
Like my favorite thing.
It's super fun. It's super gratifying when you kind of get into a pocket that feels good.
Yeah.
But it's a skill. Yeah, I think it's perhaps an under-recognized skill in design.
I mean, that's kind of the reason I wrote the book, right? It was because I recognized that as a really challenging skill that we don't talk about at all. It's just like somebody does it, but who, and what were they thinking, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I look forward to reading the rest of it. It's I've been enjoying it thus far.
Did you get to the part about ADSR envelopes?
No, but that's right up my alley.
Yeah, I was going to say, you would totally get that. So I struggled for a long time because I had this idea that if game feel was reducible to principles, then there had to be a way to like meaningfully compare the feel of controlling Tetris versus Halo was the example I wanted to use. And so the thing I came up with was trying to measure input versus game response using something approximating ADSR enveloping. So
that makes sense to me.
Tetris has basically a square wave.
Yeah, exactly. It's binary. It's like click, 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 click,
right.
Click.
And Halo is has a very quick ramp up, but a huge decay at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's fun.
So that was what
Speaking my language.
Huh?
You're speaking my language.
Exactly. And it's an interesting parallel too, right? Because ADSR was developed as a way to have digital instruments mimic real instruments better, and that's what they decided the parameters needed to be. There only needed to be 4 of them, right? And the same kind of, it's the same kind of thing where, especially in like Mario and early games where you're controlling it with just binary buttons on the NES controller, it's like, okay, how do we take these very simple binary inputs and make them feel like an organic flowing motion? And the answer is to not do it on the button side of things, but to do it on the response side of things.
Yeah, interesting. No, that's something that gives me a lot to think about, because that's definitely, one of the real values. So for those who don't know what a ADSR envelope is, it's a attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope, which controls in a synthesizer or a digital instrument, controls the articulation of the sound. So how quickly or slowly it starts, and then how quickly or slowly it fades out in the kind of simplest, shortest explanation. And there's a huge amount of, in doing kind of synthesizer sound design or sampler sound design, there's a huge amount of sort of, it's similar to game feel, where it's like this is either very responsive or it's very, it's very kind of, it supports kind of very legato kind of playing, like very slow, and being able to make those choices is a huge part of the creative process, like if you're into kind of synthesizer music, and a huge... That's very interesting. This gives me fun things to think about. I love it. Let's talk a little bit about. Let me look at my notes first to make sure I haven't left anything major on the table here. Maybe we will. I think we've covered many of the things that I wanted to talk about. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is you had the experience of. Did you do anything in your, besides teaching in academia related to game design, did you go to school for anything around games?
I went to college, and my major was computer and video imaging with a concentration in game design.
Okay, yeah, so yes.
So I learned 3D programs in Photoshop and did a lot of figure drawing, and then nobody knew how to teach game design, so we just kind of banged away. There was this thing called Motivate, which is like a visual scripting drag boxes together thing, and it was terrible. And we tried to make something in that. We succeeded, mostly because Matthew Wagner, who was the founder of Flashbang Studios, is a good programmer. Smart guy. And then so we did that, and then we moved on to this thing called Virtuals, which was like the evolved version of Motivate, where you had like logic boxes and you're like dragging little lines between them and stuff. And then we jettisoned that for Unity when Unity was first becoming a thing. But that was sort of the path to where we ended up. It's basically like we can't write C++ because we're all art students, but how can we make games? And that's kind of how we arrived.
Interesting.
I did go to school for game design technically, but it wasn't like real.
Right. Well, I mean, so that kind of is the, and this is interesting because you have some experience both on the student side and the teaching side. This is the kind of raw version of the question is it worth it for people to try to go study game design in college? Somebody who's, let's say I'm, 17-year-old Jane who wants to make games. Should I go and spend, 4 years of undergrad or, however many years of grad in an academic institution if I want to be a game designer?
Well, I would say that it really depends on who you are and how you learn and how much you're able to motivate yourself and continue working outside the context of a school. I mean, you can get a PhD from MIT for $1.50 in late charges from the public library or whatever, right? That was what they always said. Now you can just watch all of the MIT courses online.
For free.
They actually offer the courses. Like you can take the course, do the work, turn it in, and they'll grade it.
Yeah.
So you can literally get an MIT education if you're motivated enough, and you can work through all the material on your own. Most people, especially at the age you're going to college, are not that self-motivated. I think that, all right, well, this is a huge can of worms discussion that I don't want to go too deep into, but I think that public education educates people out of creativity and educates people out of being self-motivated, and it spoon-feeds them these goals. And if you look at it from a game design perspective, it's actually quite a pernicious idea to ingrain in people's heads that if they show up and they do the work and they turn it into someone, they can get an A, and the A is like the best thing that you can get. And that's kind of like making your boss happy at a job. Like you don't actually have to do a good job as long as the teacher likes you and gives you an A, or likes what you did and gives you an A, or however they were feeling in that moment when they graded it or whatever. None of that has anything to do with the real world, where you can make a game and release it, and if it's not cool, or if people don't discover it, or 100 other possible factors, it won't make any money and do well, and sort of like this meritocracy in some ways, but more like it's a really complex system that you have to interface with, and that's the real world. So if you're mentally capable and realistic about the way that things actually are, and you can be self-motivated and make games, I'd say just make games. Like a lot of times people ask me like, oh, I want to design games, how can I do that? And I'm like, just design some games. Like you don't need it. You need me to give you permission? Because here you go, yeah. I just given you permission. Like you can make games.
Here it is.
Yeah, that's not actually the problem.
Yeah.
I can give you websites to go to start learning, but if you don't go and do it, I mean, if you're the type of person who goes and learns things on your own,
you're probably not asking.
You would already know the answer to that question because you would have read a lot of people answering that question. But anyway, so I think I have some friends that are homeschooled, and I think that they're much better prepared for the reality of the world, and they do much better. I mean, I know there's this kid, Yagi, who was very big in Unity early in the cycle of Unity. And he was like 14, and he was like doing crazy advanced shader programming. He was like this homeschooled kid, and he released his first commercial game, when he was 15, and like did pretty well. It's just a monstrosity, and it's just because like no one told him that he couldn't do that, and his parents just like, oh, you want to program video games? Okay, well, just keep going deeper and deeper. Like really learn that, and keep going and going and going. Don't like stop because the class is over or whatever. But if you come from a traditional public education background, and you're not mentally mature enough to do that, you run into the kind of problem where you like well, the first game you ever make, it has to be like your magnum opus MMO GTA thing or whatever. In that instance, a class is good because if it forces you to make 10 different games over the course of the semester, then it can break your education. It can break you out of that habit and get you on the right track and get your mind straight. I don't know if it's worth the money. Colleges cost so much money now.
That's a huge factor. I think that I couldn't agree with pretty much everything that you said more. Even though I'm a teacher, I'm probably as anti-school as it gets, and always fought against school my whole life. And then it was only when I got to be 16 and got to go do internships instead of go to school that I was like amazing. So I agree that I think that the community aspect, the kind of meeting other like-minded people who want to make games is certainly very valuable in a physical room, and then the kind of the structure and discipline of it is certainly useful for most people perhaps, because that's hard to sit in a room by yourself and do something for months and months and not give up.
I do think that there's a problem because I think like once you get out of college, you have to unlearn.
Yeah.
The you don't have the stick of the class and the structure telling you what to do anymore, and it's like, all right, well, I could get up and work on this thing, or I could go do something else, and it's like, well, if you relied on that structure for that discipline and you don't have it anymore, then I don't think it's reasonable to expect. It's like a muscle, right? Like you have to build up the ability to work at a stretch for a long time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I do think that that's a great. I mean, that's a. I think to avoid going into kind of like the evils of education discussion, which would probably go on for 9 hours. A good kind of way to wrap that up is just to say, as you say, whether or not you go to school, you're going to come out and you're still going to need that skill of self-discipline, finishing, self-motivation, and so it's a great reason to just start working on your projects or other people's projects or whatever, but just start working on projects independent of that structure as early as you can.
Right.
And you'll be in a good place whether you go to school or not,
And I think the real benefit of not ever going to public school is that you're not afraid of failure, because when you go to school, failure is the worst thing that can happen. You answer the question wrong. That's the worst thing. It's so stupid.
Humiliated.
Yeah, because what you really want is you want failure to be the opposite. You want failure to be like, oh, that was interesting, a learning experience. Okay, I'll move on to making my next thing, right? It's like the idea that failing is so bad and like your work is so bound up with you. I think it leads inevitably to this situation where you're like, I can't release this thing. I can't keep going, and then you just get so like hung up on the fact that the thing you're making right now isn't good, and you know it's not good, but you're like afraid to keep going because so much of yourself is tied up in it not being a failure. So it's like, and then it creates a lot of angst that didn't need to be there, because like your stuff is gonna suck, right? It's like the 10,000 hours rule. Like it's gonna suck. It's just too bad. Sorry. Yes, it sucks. It's gonna suck. You need to keep making things that suck until your things suddenly one day don't suck.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, and I mean, I think I think that is the barrier for most people. Is that it's too painful they're like, oh, I want to make games. I have visions of games in my head, and then they like make their first thing, and it just really, really sucks, and it's just like, oh my God, my self-image has been destroyed. Of like that I'm going to turn out to be the Orson Welles of game design and make like the awesome game on the first try, and it's going to be easy and great, and people are going to shower me with money and love.
Right, and that's what everybody thinks they want. I don't know. I think as you get mature as an artist, what you realize is that what you want is just to communicate with the audience, and then that all the fame and fortune part of it is just it's a false finish line. It's it's not a reasonable. Line, right? It's not a reason to make things. It's an outcome that happens if you make a lot of things over a long period of time, and you constantly hone your craft. My friend Alexander Bruce, the creator of Antichamber. If you haven't watched his talk from this year's GDC, I think it's online for free. It's called Antechamber, an overnight success, 7 years in the making.
Yeah, I did watch that. It's very good.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to have, especially young aspiring game designers look at, because we do have a huge survivorship bias, and we do focus on the outliers like Notch and Tommy and Edmund and whoever, John, Derek. These people are really good at what they did, and they've done a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff. I mean, Edmund in particular, fuck. Have you ever gone back and looked at how many games he's made?
No.
Your jaw will hit the floor. Like, it's crazy how many games he's made. And some of his first ones are really bad, He doesn't care. He just keeps making stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, something that I have been really, that I kind of know intellectually, but I've been working on kind of drilling into my own head emotionally, is just attaching to learning as the product, to be like,
Right.
Yes, I just spent 8 months making this thing that I'm now going to have to like draw a line under, and it's not going to be awesome,
Right. Yep.
But that was 8 months of me learning C#, and now I can actually make a prototype in like an afternoon, and so it's a huge win and a huge success, as opposed to like 8 months down the drain, failure, shame, like.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, nobody talks about this, but I think if you ask any of those guys, name anyone that you think is successful as a game designer and you really admire their work, I guarantee you they have a folder on their computer with 20 games that they started and never showed anybody. But none of those things were a waste of time.
Yeah.
Like maybe they didn't even finish the prototype before they decided it wasn't worth continuing going. None of that was a waste of time. All of that was useful.
Totally. No, and it's an interesting thing. This is a slight tangent, but I think it's sort of relevant. Is Notch, has now got himself in this weird position where it's kind of going back to what you were saying about people kind of struggling with success. Is that
I know what you're gonna say, yeah.
Yeah, he can't just like do just like a little wacky prototype. It's like everybody's like, oh my god, the next Minecraft, it's
Right.
gonna be amazing, and he's like, oh, I don't want to work on it anymore, and everybody's like, oh,
Yeah, no, it's kind of ruined his. People are like, they look at Notch, and then I tell them I make indie games. They're like, oh, you want to be as successful as Notch? I'm like, To me, that seems like a curse. Like, okay, on the one hand, it's like, okay, wow, there are Minecraft toys in Target, and the display is as big as the Lego display.
Yeah. Dude,
Minecraft,
like my 5-year-old son, that's what he likes, Minecraft.
Yeah.
Like,
and that is an indelible, mark that has been left on culture, and so Notch has this really great legacy, and he can kind of be at peace with the fact that he did something that really contributed to culture or something. That's awesome. But he can never make anything again. Like,
it's tough.
He's gonna have to adopt a pseudonym.
That's what I would do.
That's what I would do if I was him. Yeah. But I mean, he stopped working on whatever X
0110X, whatever.
Yeah. And I think it's just because of the pressure, right? It's like, how do you follow up Minecraft? How do you do it? It's impossible.
Yeah. No, I mean it's tough, and that's the weird, distorting power of money and fame. I mean, look at Orson Welles.
Right.
It's brutal. Ended up doing cat food commercials and peaked at 21 or whatever the hell it was, and kind of ruined his life in a weird way. Although there's Citizen Kane, so.
Yeah, so it's like, well, you'd rather have some success than no success, but it does seem like it can be a curse. I think it really depends. If you're the right type of person and you're pretty even keel about the whole thing, if you look at it as a series of like a sine wave, and there are hills and valleys, and it's going to be up and it's going to be down, and all you try to do is just flatten the wave out and just keep making stuff. Just make stuff, and that's all you really care about doing. I think you'll be fine. And, you look at people who've had huge successes like Quentin Tarantino or whatever. Like, he clearly doesn't care about being famous. He clearly just cares about making movies. And so you look at those people, you'd be like, yeah, like David Lynch, like,
Yeah, totally.
Not good at success.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really good, I think that for whatever reason, video games being video games, and with things like Minecraft going on, or everybody talks about, the video games industry is bigger than gambling and bigger than this and that, and so people kind of look at it and think, oh yes, this is a way to make money, you do have to remember that you're signing up to be an artist, and it's going to be there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty involved, and if you don't have a tolerance for uncertainty, even people who are working in studios, I mean, all these studio jobs. Oh, and that's actually the last thing I wanted to ask you from my list of questions.
They're terrible jobs. I mean, it's a terrible. It's like if you want to make money, go become an oil geologist, or if you want to make money as a programmer, go work for a defense contractor or something.
Yeah, or a bank or something. Yeah.
You gotta love making games because it's a shit job most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't go that far now, but it's well, not that I have any great authority to say about it, but I think that you just have to understand the reward is in the process, and it's like if you love sitting at the computer in your underwear coding or whatever it is, that's going to be your reward. Like that's what you get, and you're lucky if you get to keep doing it and not have to go work at a bank,
Right.
But
and I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that if you only care about money, there's no reason to make it. And
it's not a good way to make money.
Yeah, like you should only make games if you really, really want to, because it's a lot of really hard work and it really puts you through the emotional ringer. Because, I mean, if you're honest, if you're an indie developer like me, like my fiance, like any of those guys we talked about before, as we said, you are the product.
Yeah.
You and the game are so intertwined that there's really no reasonable difference between the two, especially from like a how will I market it, will it be successful or not. A lot of it's just whether or not people like you and think that you're a cool person, whether or not they'll cover your game. And it's like, that is so crushing sometimes. Like the burden of that is really crushing because it's like sometimes you need to do an interview or talk to someone from the press or like talk to a YouTuber and you just like are feeling introverted, like you don't want to talk to anybody and you just got to be on. So it can be exhausting, I think. And like if you feel like your game's not going well, you'll just be really depressed. Like, I don't know, I think, this is not true for every indie developer, but I think most indie developers would say that they get really depressed sometimes and they have at least some mental craziness that would have driven them to do this crazy thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good advice, and it's a good thing to kind of prepare people for. I mean, the thing that in my music teaching, what I try to drill into people's head is just the opposite of that. It's like you are not your work. Your work will succeed or fail. That's not you. That's not your worth as a human being. If people like your work, it doesn't mean that they don't like you, which is why it's a good idea to have a life outside your work.
Right. Well, and I think that will lead you to make much more interesting games. Like if you have an interesting life, you can make much more interesting games.
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. Well, okay, so I'm taking up a lot of your time. The last question I wanted to ask was, which is a little bit random, but just so you out of college, you went, or maybe not directly out, but you went and worked at Neversoft, which you've spoken publicly about, and your kind of the struggles in making Tony Hawk 5.
Tony Hawk Underground.
Tony Hawk Underground, yeah, and as a kind of a part of a path to experience, is that something that you think people should seek out, or is it a waste of time?
Well, I'm gonna go philosophical, and I'm gonna say that was a particular time and place, and for me at that particular time and place, it was a good experience. I don't think it's a necessary experience anymore, and in 2003. It was really hard to make games by yourself, and there wasn't an audience for games, and there was like little games, and Steam didn't exist, and it wasn't, I don't think it did. No, Half-Life 2 hadn't come out yet. So it really, that was where you needed to go if you were serious about being a game designer. You need to get a job at a studio, and Tony Hawk was a good job for me because it's a very game designy game. There's a lot of mechanics, there's a lot of design and how those mechanics work and so on. So it was a very beneficial experience for me, and it also taught me that I have no business working in a studio. It's just I don't have the personality for it. I'm too much of a dick, I guess. like I can't just keep my fucking mouth shut. Like I was a junior designer or whatever. And I'm like looking at the game and I'm like, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? And just like you just can't do that in a studio. Like there are a lot of people working there, and it's true that a lot of people have been there a lot longer than you, and they've thought about all these things that you're saying. And you just need to shut your fucking mouth, because there's probably some reason that things are done the way they are, even if that reason is like really unsatisfying. Because like the actual reason, if I reflect on it, that things were not the way that I would have done them, is because you got to ship a fucking game. Like,
yeah,
it's not the most important thing on the list.
And there's some like brutal compromise that somebody had to sit there and make and feel crushed about, and then you're coming in and being like, "What? This sucks. Why are we doing this?"
Right, yeah, I mean, it's just like when you come into a room and a whole conversation has just happened, like an hour-long conversation, and you're like, well, why don't we just do it this way? And the two people are just like I'm not going to have that whole conversation again.
Yeah.
Even if you're right.
Yeah, so, well, probably especially if you're right.
Especially if you're right, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I need to be able to do my own thing and not piss people off. That's good, I think.
Excellent. Well,
but yeah, so I mean, if you're wanting to be a game designer and you're just getting started right now, just make games. The tools are out there. Think of the game that you want to make, and then don't make that at all. Make something really simple, but maybe choose a tool based on that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Don't be afraid to drop something if you're totally failing too. Like if you just get way out of your depth in terms of programming and you're frozen up, just chuck that whole thing and go start something simpler.
Yeah, that's really good advice right there. Awesome. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking some time to come on the show. I really enjoyed the conversation and really appreciate your sharing your accumulated wisdom. And for those who would like to learn more about Scale, learn more about you, where should they go?
I have steveswink.com. Hasn't been updated very much lately. Scale-game.com is like the place where Scale stuff lives. There's a lot of information on the Kickstarter page. The answer is that it's kind of diffused right now, but you know, it's out there if you're looking for information. Game Feel is available on Amazon. I think there's a Kindle version now, digital version, so it's cool.
There is. That's the version I got. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's out there. I mean, Scale is probably the thing that's the highest profile that I've done. A lot of people know about because of the Kickstarter and stuff. So yeah, more stuff on that soon. I'll get more organized. Like I'm kind of in this place where I'm just like working on the game, and I just don't have the bandwidth to care about any of that stuff right now.
Cool. Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely plenty of stuff to learn about Scale online, and I'll definitely be watching that. Looking forward to seeing where that goes. And yeah, just thanks again, and talk soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.